I'm Aryan. It's a beautiful day outside, and you're tuned into Climate Action Figures.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Climate Action Figures. I am your host, John, and this week on the show, you get to meet a young man who has a fascinating project underway. We'll hear all about that in a minute. But first, this week's Quick Fix, which comes this week from Alida in Halifax, who wrote in to say, take Tupperware to restaurants to reduce takeout container waste. Seems like a great idea. Well, welcome, Aryan. What do you think about that quick fix?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me here on the podcast. And about the quick fix, I think it's like amazing. It's definitely a great quick fix for even the smallest things. Um, bringing Tupperware to like restaurants where like lots of single-use containers are used for takeout. It's really great because many of these times, as not a lot of people are not really educated on where to recycle things like that. It can be really useful and help the environment, one piece of Tupperware at a time.
Exactly. And let's be clear, Tupperware is not a sponsor of the show. In fact, we have no sponsors. I think she's talking about any kind of reusable container that you can take home and wash and reuse. So that's
Yeah.
great. Thanks, Alita, for that. Now, Aryan, we were introduced by Michelle from Youth Central. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that is, Youth Central?
Yeah, so right now in Calgary, Youth Central is essentially like a volunteer place where youth 13 years old to 18-year-olds can all participate in various activities, and lots of these activities are even environmentally friendly. And that's exactly where I got my grant from Michelle, as she's the leader of the Calgary Youth Environment Corps, which gave me my Jack Leslie Environment Award.
Well, that's great. So thank you, Michelle, for making the introduction. And Michelle told me about a little bit about this Jack Leslie Youth Environment Grant. Did I name that correctly?
Yeah.
So do you want to tell us a bit about that grant?
Yeah, so basically, the Jack Leslie Youth Environment Grant. Jack Leslie was actually like a mayor back in the 90s, the 1900s, I believe. And he was known in a tough time where lots of like people really focused on economics and things like that. He was one of the only mayors to really care about the environment, and he changed a lot of it. He saw that Calgary was like really like not really filled with nature. The bees weren't buzzing, the birds weren't chirping, but he decided to create a really nice environment. And to honor his tribute to Calgary, the Jack Leslie Youth Environment Grant gives 3 awards, two to group projects and one to an individual project about saving and helping Calgary's environment. And I was one of the individual projects awarded.
Oh, that's very cool. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the project that you've done that has earned you this award?
Yeah, yeah. So to really start off with all the background, I live across like lots of different ponds and lakes. I live in that type of area. And last summer in 2022, a cool fact was like there used to be a lot of wildlife. There used to be like maybe you could say 900 geese in these ponds because they were pretty big ponds. They were like so much like animals. It was great. It was a beautiful scene. Last summer in 2023, I noticed like there were very, very low amounts of geese, very, very low amounts of like habitat, wildlife. And I really genuinely wondered like what happened to these geese, especially in a hot time where they didn't want to like migrate yet. They were just like, chilling in the pond, things like that. So I really wondered. And so I decided to go and actually check like what's happening in the pond, if there's actually something. And I saw little specks of like colored pieces of I didn't know at the time. So I collected them, and I also saw like bigger pieces like plastic bags, and I realized that these were plastics. And it really led me to thinking like, oh, there's microplastics in our water bodies. So I, of course, did some research more onto this, and I learned that plastic doesn't actually degrade normally like compost does, banana peels do, but rather just gets smaller and smaller and turns into microplastics, like this small, this small, things like that. And the problem I saw was that these geese were mistaking these things for like food, eggs, like, and they you ate them and they saw it. This is as a danger as many like of the geese probably were getting hurt and probably left that area. And so I decided my project was dedicated towards essentially saving these animals, not in only in Calgary, but around the world where microplastics were seen.
So
Yeah.
I just want to look back at that microplastic issue for a second, because this is, you've done all the research. So tell us, this is why we're not supposed to burn plastics, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's also another contributing factor. Microplastics don't always have to be in water bodies. That's what I saw, but they can get so small into like a nanoplastic, which is something that's microscopic, which is something you can't even see. And it is actually, I've did some research. It's been seen in human bloodstream. So that was a very shocking fact.
Wow.
Of course, like I need like very big lab equipment to try to solve nanoplastic issues, but for the time where I see it's in water and these like small plastics I can actually detect, I tried figuring out ways to actually get it out of these waters.
Okay, so you're thinking to yourself, I've seen this plastic in the water. Maybe this is causing the problem with the geese leaving or disappearing. So, what's the first thing you think of in terms of how is it possible to separate the water from these tiny bits of plastic?
I started off by actually, like what everybody would think, a filter, which is a great thing, if you had just a big like piece of like, mesh or something, you just like sway it around the pond. But the pond is huge, and I actually tried doing it, but it took lots of time for even a small bit. And that's kind of where my project came in because I started identifying, what are the biggest problems? And I realized, some of the problems are like it takes too much time and it takes more people. And I researched more into it and I saw there was in 2016 back in Bow River, there was a big microplastic spill from unknown sources. Actually, it hasn't been figured out yet, but there are little white pellets. And what happened was everybody, lots of workers tried to clean it up, but it took lots of workers and lots of time. And I realized, it also happened to me when I was trying to do my part. And since, not everybody that has the time to try to filter out of all these ponds, I could try to use our technology in our world, which is like robots and how they can do things by themselves and try to use that to solve the problem.
Okay, so as you researched this, what came into your brain in terms of, I'm just picturing you imagining some kind of a machine, robotic machine that's going through the water. Were you picturing something that had moving parts that would gather it in, or that would cruise along and scoop it up, or which way is your thinking gone?
Well, there was a lot of thinking involved. It all started really last year after the summer. There was like a lot of iterations. I first, of course, began thinking of like I have to create a bot and have motors attached to it on like either side essentially and have some type of filter on it. And I also wanted to have an actual sensing device. And the reason for this was because in ponds and lakes, there isn't just plastics. There is still very important organic
Oh, of
matters, which are
course.
important. Yeah. And so I realized that, if I filter this, then I could be scooping up fish eggs. I could be scooping up sticks and stones, which may be really needed for these animals.
Wow. I was going to ask you how your bot is going to discern between the plastics and the non-plastics, but what stage are you at this point? Is it in development yet, or is it still in your brain? Where are we at?
Well, it actually is, it is almost like finished. I'm on the final stages of coding right now, actually. There's a lot of like science and research I had to back this up with, and I went through many iterations. Like my first iteration detecting was something called machine learning. You may be like uh familiar with it. It's basically like feeding AI a bunch of images until it realizes. And although I was able to like have machine learning detect like maybe an actual big piece of plastic bag or a plastic bottle, it gets really hard for machines to detect small specks of it because it can look identical to like a stick. It can look identical to a speck of a rock, and that's not very easy. Like even I couldn't discern.
Right.
So what I did was I looked into like actual like chemical properties of plastics and how they react to certain things, and it led me to it's hard to fully explain this, but essentially I learned something about how UV light is affected by these plastics. So when it is shined on these plastics, most of the plastics absorb them and release like a longer wavelength of light, which is known as fluorescence. And I detected this using something called a photodetector, which detects light intensity.
Wow. So your machine will actually look, beam some of the UV light, and then see what comes back.
Yes, yeah, and see if these values like relate. And of course, I had to test this, like see if any got any false positives. I tested like all six different types of plastics, like low density polyethylene, high density PVC, all these things. But I noticed very distinct differences. So they all had like, before applying UV light, the photodetector had like different like readings, but generally for all of these plastics, they had very specific readings, which led me to some of my conclusions and like testing it out in the pond.
Okay. So once your machine decides this is plastic, then what does it do?
That's where my filter comes in. And my filter is essentially like attached to the side of my bot. And of course, right, the filter can't just be open because then that just takes my whole that point of the project away. If I just have an open filter, of course, anything can go through. So it's essentially a closed filter until it realizes something in plastic. Then with something called a servo, it opens the filter. A servo basically just like can like it's something like moves like this or that, and it opens like a piece of it opens like the front of the filter, so then it goes through the plastic.
Wow. And so it's filtering after it decides what the properties are of this item that it's looking at.
Yes, it does.
So I'm curious to know if there is a mixture of, say, fish eggs and little tiny bits of plastic. How would it discern which one stays and which one goes?
Currently, things like that are in, of course, the development stage, but essentially, if you really think about it, if there's a mix of like many different like values or readings that it's getting, if the value I've coded, like if the value's not like actually been staying strong for around like 10, 20 seconds, then it won't filter because there could be some type of false positive in that sense.
Right. Now, I'm just going to take a moment to blow our audience's minds by asking, if you don't mind sharing, your age.
My age, I am currently 13 years old.
So this you're listening to a 13-year-old talk about his filtration system for microplastics. This is fascinating. So as you have had this in development, I'm curious to know what your inspiration was. Inspiration in terms of models, or just your inspiration in terms of how you got this idea that I can do this. So, is there a particular person who inspired you, or a particular model of, I've read about these out in the ocean, these bots that are going cleaning up plastics out of the ocean. Tell us a little bit about your inspirations.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of inspirations, of course. Since a young age, I have been like really interested in like since I travel a lot and I've actually been to the ocean a lot. I've already seen firsthand these plastics, but then I researched, there is this company called the Ocean Cleanup company where they use these really, really big like clean like filtration devices, and it really, really fascinated me at the time, and they're still working really hard. And I wanted, like, they even said in their website, like, how can you help? So that's also kind of what sparked my interest. I'm like, how can I help? I want to see my kids grow up in a society where it isn't hindered by all these distractions, and I want them, and like even future generations to have a good life by solving even small issues like this.
Wow. And as you see these companies that are building these machines that clean water, do you think this could be a career for you someday?
Oh, I mean, definitely. I mean, I could be improving this until high school and university and trying to create maybe even a business out of it.
Now, you're in school, clearly. I'm wondering if this
Mhm.
somehow connects into school, like your teacher gave you a project and you're like, oh, I'm just going to use my water cleaner for that project. Is that sort of meshed into your schoolwork somehow, or is this independent of school?
Oh, this is definitely independent. There isn't really like an assignment to try to filter microplastics as a school
No,
assignment.
generally in junior high, that's not a project, right?
Yeah, yeah. Right now, I mean, in science, we're still doing like still pretty cool stuff. Like, I mean, we're looking at circuits and stuff. I mean, all things that generally did actually help me in learning my project because I didn't just build the robot out of scratch. I had to watch a lot of online tutorials, see how other people made robots, and then try to create one of my own. So school did play a role in helping me understand some fundamentals.
Yeah, for sure. Our audience is going to be dying to see this. So, can I post a picture of this on our social media?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm actually just doing some final coding and I'm going to be submitting this to my regional science fair. So I'm creating a video and I have a bunch of photos ready and I'll be sending that to you so everybody can
Great.
see what I've been
Well, we will
doing.
post that on our social media, so you don't have to use your imagination too much. You can have a look and see what it looks like. And so, science fair, you're going to be competing in science fair with this project.
Yes, yes.
Wow, that's a pretty compelling project to be putting out there.
Definitely hope I can do well in it.
Our time is almost up, so I need to get to your climate action. And for your climate action, I mean, it could be this project. Obviously, that's huge, or it can be something completely different. Do you have a climate action for us today?
Well, something that's completely different, I mean, is mowing the lawn completely different?
Oh, sure, yeah. Tell us about mowing the
Yeah.
lawn.
So a lot of people, it's like really small, right? But when you mow the lawn, a lot of people think of, raking it, putting sometimes in the trash or compost. And while these things are not necessarily bad, but sometimes they can get sidetracked in the world we live in. But what I do actually, something that many people don't know about is that if you keep your grass on, like, when the lawnmower mows it, it's actually good for, maintaining the health and the soil's health. It's actually very good for it since like uh dead grass still contains all these nutrients and it gives back to the environment, but not only to the soil, but it gives back to like even like animals, rabbits that can like, eat this grass and like, it just helps it in the end.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'd say you're ahead of your time.
Thank you.
Well, Aryan, just before we let you go, you're constantly reminded through your research of all these microplastics in our environment and the danger they pose. So, with all that swimming around in your brain, what gives you hope?
Yeah, so really what gives me hope is all the kids, making climate action in today's world. It's not just me. There are so many kids. And moreover, all these like grants and competitions that you can showcase your work really because a lot of people when they don't really have a purpose, they don't really like doing, but when they have a purpose, when they could showcase and when they could really like help the environment, it shows that they want to actually do it. But there already is so many climate action figures out in our world, and a lot of them are kids, which is really good. And it really gives me hope because I know now that, including me and a lot of others, we can help in the future, near coming future. We can all help to do our part and save our environment, keep Earth going.
Wow. And bonus point for working the name of the podcast into your answer. That was not rehearsed. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Aryan.
Thank you for having me.
And all the best as you go forward with your project. We'll look forward to hearing that, and we'll post on social media if you want to send us, how things are continuing to go in the future. We'll absolutely throw that onto our social media.
Definitely.
And thank you, listener, for joining us today. If you know of a youth who is doing cool things, large or small, to look after the environment, contact us via social media or email. And we will be back again next week to hear from another climate action figure. Until then,
Go figures!
This has been Climate Action Figures. Our show is produced and hosted by John Whidden. Our creative consultant is Kayla McIntosh. Our theme song is Hawaii Vacation by Tavari. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Climate Action Figures. That's all one word. And if you have any other questions or comments that arose from this or any episode, feel free to reach out to us at climateactionfigures@gmail.com. And thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another Climate Action Figure.